I was really beginning to lose control of myself. I don't know if people always feel this way in ghost encounters, but I thought I was gonna die. Welcome back. Today we're going to be doing something a little bit different. I've had a few requests for stories to help you relax and fall asleep. So what better for my first narration than some true ghost stories? So get comfy, close your eyes, and we'll begin. Number 1. The Dead Here Still Walk by davidC. The story I'm about to tell scares the hell out of me just trying to recall it up from my memories. Some things are better left dead and buried. After having read the stories on this site, I think it might help me rest easier having let others know the terror I've experienced at the hand of the supernatural. It all began in 1992 when I moved into a house in Ironton, Ohio, a small town in the southern tip of the state. I moved into an old house that was over 100 years old. At first, things were normal, considering getting used to the creaks and moans an older home emits when settling after the sun sets. About 2 weeks after, I experienced my first encounter. I had just finished watching David Letterman and was proceeding with shutting up the house for the night. It was early October, and the night was beginning to get chilly, so I shut the windows I had opened and went into the kitchen to shut the lights off. The kitchen had a basement door in it, and as I reached for the light switch, I heard distinctive footsteps climbing up the old wooden steps, ascending up from the musty, damp basement. I froze and listened as the footsteps continued to slowly walk up to the kitchen. Up until this moment, I had never felt so scared in my life. I knew it couldn't have been a burglar or anything like that because there was no windows or doors in the basement save for the one in my kitchen. Finally, the footsteps stopped at the landing at the top of the steps, and I watched in disbelief as the doorknob turned and the old wooden door slowly opened and slammed shut with an ear-shattering slam. I was there long enough that night to notice that no one stepped through the doorway. I quickly grabbed my jacket and left to go stay with a relative for the remainder of the night. As time went on, I heard the footsteps and the door open and shut on several occasions, and it still bothered me, but I was determined not to let this drive me out of this beautiful old house. As you will see, this was just the tip of the iceberg as far as haunting goes. I did some research on the history of the house, and to my surprise, I discovered that in 1956, a murder-suicide took place there. As told to me by several of the longtime residents of the community, what had happened was a couple by the name of Gilbert had lived there in the 50s, and the husband had caught his wife cheating on him, and in a crime of passion, he slit the wife's throat as she slept, and right afterward went to the basement and hung himself. The official record stated that he was found hanging from the basement beams, covered in his wife's blood, and the knife used in the murder lay on the floor below his dangling corpse. After learning of these events, it was difficult to say the least not to think about the hideous deeds that this house harbored. About a month after the encounter at the basement door, I had a friend from out of town over for the weekend. It was an extended weekend due to the Memorial Day holiday. This was their first visit to my new home, and due to the circumstances, I purposely held back any information on what I had learned and encountered for fear of scaring them away, and it also gave me the chance to get feedback from an unbiased source. Joe and Sheila arrived late Friday night, and we drank coffee and chatted until around 1 a.m., and then turned it in for the night. Around 3:30 a.m., I was awakened by a scream. Joe and I found Sheila in the hallway, shaking uncontrollably. After getting her calmed down, we found that on her way to the bathroom, she saw a woman in white coming towards her in the hallway, and in her own words, her throat had looked as if it had been torn away. That was the last night they stayed in my home. I can't say I blame them. The final event which drove me from this house happened late one night before going to bed. I went through my usual routine of showering and shaving, but as I stood shaving peering into the foggy mirror, a figure appeared behind me. It was the woman's husband. I saw an almost blank look in his eyes as if he was looking past me, and his mouth was agape as if moaning a silent cry. I never ran so hard in my life. I gathered a few necessities and fled the house for the final time. I came back about a week later with friends and gathered up my belongings, never to return again. I've been fortunate not to experience any strange occurrences like that in my present home, and hopefully never again. Number 2. Ghost Encounter in an Old Hospital by BigSouza. I was a security officer at an old hospital in Massachusetts, which was purchased by the state and had several abandoned floors and wings. The hospital contained a detox unit, a court-ordered program for people convicted of drunken driving offenses, and of all things to go along with these programs, a unit for people suffering from respiratory difficulties. We were required to do patrols throughout all areas of the hospital, interior and exterior, and even check the floors and wings that had not been in service for years. I had been working in the hospital for about 4 months at the time on the overnight shift, and although I was slightly weary of checking these vacant floors, which were in semi-darkness at the time, I tried to put any fears I may have out of my head. There were 2 of us on during the midnight shift, and I think it was either at 2 or 3 in the morning when it was my turn to do the rounds. I started the way I usually did, working from the 6th floor down. I began to check the 2nd floor, which at one time was a wing to treat terminally ill patients. I knew that's what it was for at one time, but never really thought anything of it. I checked the floor from one end to the other, checking all the rooms and the old office behind the nurse's station, and all was clear. As I started making my way back towards the elevator to go to the 1st floor, I heard the sound of voices. I could not make out whether it was 2 or 3, but they were without a doubt there, coming from not too far down the hall that I had just checked. The first thing that came to mind was that these were detox clients that had gotten off their unit, passed the detox staff, and made their way down to the 2nd floor and were fooling around, possibly hiding in the closets of one of the rooms I had just checked. I listened very intently to be sure of myself and could clearly hear the voices. The strange thing was that they sounded like they were just voices, which could be heard very clearly, but there were no words, just voices. I called out down the hall for whoever it was to step out of the room and into the hallway. I got no response to this request, so I called out again. Still no response, but the voices were still there. I used my radio to contact my partner and alert her that I had a trespass situation on the 2nd floor, what I was dealing with, and that I needed her assistance. The response I got back over the radio came back broken up and nearly inaudible. To me personally, that was no surprise, as it was a typical occurrence with our communication systems. But I was sure I had gotten a response out of her, as I thought I heard her voice through all the crackling and interference. I began to make my way down the hall, thinking without a doubt in my mind I was dealing with detox clients. I called out again for whoever it was to step out into the hallway. That's when I noticed the temperature suddenly drop in the hallway that was warm just a few seconds ago due to the fact that it was a warm September night. And although in the back of my mind I knew it was there, it finally hit me that a crackling sound was coming over my radio even though I had not hit the button to transmit. I tried once again to contact my partner over the radio, knowing full well that if she heard me the first time, she would have been here by now. But the crackling and interference continued to come over the radio, whether I hit the transmit button or not. At that point, I could feel something was just not right, but I tried to tell myself that this was just a couple of people who had wandered into the old hospital out of the service unit. I noticed at this time that the voices had gotten louder and the hallway had gotten colder, and all I could think about was getting off the floor to the elevator or the stairway. The stairway was closer to me, so I turned and began searching for my keys to unlock the door. The voices were louder now and more persistent, and I could clearly hear footsteps along with them, not coming from one direction in the hallway, but all directions. The voices started coming from all directions as well, and that's when I fell to the floor, which was ice cold, just as cold as putting your hand on a steel fence outside during the dead of winter. I wanted to push myself away from the floor as soon as I touched it, but I didn't have the energy to do so. All I could hear was voices, but I could still not make out what was being said, and the footsteps were growing louder. I was on my hands and knees looking at the floor, and I was struggling to hold my head up just so I could find the door leading to the stairs. But what instead caught my attention was what looked like several people walking around me. I couldn't make out what they looked like or if they were male or female, as they had no faces and no type of clothing could be seen. They simply looked like wrinkles and blurs in the air with a human shape walking all around me through the dimly lit hallways. It was then that one of these shapes walked toward me, and I was still on hands and knees and walked right through me. At that point, I had severe difficulty breathing and seemed to lose more control of myself physically. I struggled painfully to get air into my lungs and then force it out. After repeating this process several times, I noticed a funny taste in my mouth and then noticed several small puddles of blood on the floor, which I was exhaling with the air. It was then that I panicked and forced myself to the stairwell door with every ounce of strength that I had, which was not much, and when I almost had myself standing, fell to the floor again. I was really beginning to lose control of myself at this point due to the fact that I was very scared, and I don't know if people always feel this way in ghost encounters, but I thought I was gonna die. I was still having difficulty breathing and still had blood coming up from my throat. I was also shaking uncontrollably and was struggling to regain control of myself, as the hallway was still very active with voices, footsteps, and blurry images which continued to wander up and down the unit. I tried once again for the keys and practically crawled to the stairwell door. My hand touched the doorknob, which, even though I was very cold already, was absolutely freezing and almost stingingly painful to the touch. I grabbed for the key, the whole time thinking that it was so cold that the lock may be frozen. I managed to control my shaking just long enough to get the key into the lock and turn it. I fell through the door and out of the unit out into the stairwell, crawling from the hallway to the stairs. The door finally closed once I got my legs out of the way, and the warm air in the dimly lit stairwell hit me almost immediately, and I could feel some of my energy coming back. If this phenomena was still going on behind the door I had just exited, I didn't care one bit. I wanted to get as far away from it as I could. I grabbed the railing for support and walked myself, still quite shaken, down the stairs to the first floor and into a bathroom. I was breathing easier now, but was coughing heavily. I made my way to a toilet, which I coughed several blood clots up into, and when I was done, checked myself out in the mirror. My eyes were glassy and bloodshot, my skin was very pale, and for a guy freezing his rear off a few minutes ago, sweating like a pig. I splashed some cold water onto my face, toweled off, and tried to compose myself the best I could, and then made my way back to the security office, where my partner immediately noticed that I wasn't back in the same condition that I had left in earlier. She questioned me on why I took so long on my patrol, at which point I realized that she did not get my transmission over the radio earlier, and when I asked her about it, she stated that she had a radio with her the whole time and not once did she receive a transmission from me. I used the excuse of illness for the reason why the patrol took as long as it did, and further stated that I thought I should go home. A replacement was called in for me, and I left immediately upon his arrival. I arrived home and sat in the living room trying to make sense of what happened, but I couldn't. I never spoke a word of this to my fiancé, my co-workers on that job, or the one that I have now, or any of my friends until last night. I still don't fully understand what happened that morning, and although I was apparently hurt physically, I don't think it was done intentionally by whatever it was. I had been on that floor several times before and never encountered anything at all like what I came face to face with then, or anywhere else throughout the hospital for that matter. I think I may just have been there at the wrong time, or my presence there set something off. There's not a day that goes by that I don't think about what happened. I never spoke about it because, like a lot of other people who have been in similar situations, I thought nobody would believe me or they would think I'm crazy. I was very scared at the time, but looking back on it, it was a frightening but interesting experience, and I actually hope to have another encounter without the same side effects. Thank you for giving me the opportunity to write about this experience, and thank you for listening. Number 3, Okinawan Hauntings, Dorm 148, by Carmen.Hartmann. I live on Kadena Air Force Base, Okinawa, Japan. My first really haunting experience with ghosts came from living at the old H-style dormitories that are condemned now and being torn down. Unfortunately, on this island, under military contracts with the locals, they have to leave a building standing for 40 years before tearing it down. So, you can imagine how old some of these buildings are. The dormitory I lived in was haunted. All the old H-style dorms are, or were haunted while they were still erect. They call them H-style from the shape they make, 2 floors on one side of the H and 2 on the other, with 2 floors connecting them directly in the middle. And in the middle area was where our day rooms are, or living room, and a kitchenette. Anyways, we lived in rooms about 6 foot by 6 foot with smallish 2 foot by 3 foot windows, no blinds, and a 3 foot cement ledge that runs outside your window on the second floor all the way around the building. The stairwells are located at each end of the long side of the H, and 2 stairwells at opposite ends leading down into the living room area inside the center of each hallway. The bathrooms are like college dorms and have 5 individual showers, then 5 toilets and 3 urinals on the opposite side, divided by 2 walls and 4 sinks. 3 of the 4 actual floors with rooms were male, and the 4th was a strictly female floor. The ghosts made themselves known to me about the 2nd month that I had lived there. I remember sleeping in my rather small single bed with a nearly pitch black room. Even though I had a window that faced out to where the streetlight shone brightly in, no light shone in through my window that night. My window was cracked and there was no breeze to blow in. I heard what sounded like a loud crash, like a door slamming shut, although my bed was right next to the door, so I knew it wasn't mine. I was terrified and I was cold all over. I hid under the covers until I knew it was daylight again. In the morning, when I finally dared to stick my head out, I found that all my picture frames that were sitting on my dresser top had all been tipped over face down. I couldn't explain it. That wasn't the only thing that gave us the idea that there were ghosts among us. The communal shower heads had the amazing power to turn themselves on and off. I would be showering for work at 0400, and because the other showers were so close, I knew there was no one else in the bathroom with me. And the other showers would randomly turn themselves on. The toilets would flush themselves and the sink would run water all day. The carpeting in the hallway outside the bathrooms, in fact, was always soggy from the water overflowing from the bathrooms. The men's bathrooms on the other 3 floors suffered the same incidents. One specific occasion that really sent chills down my spine was once again early in the morning at about 0400. Everyone else in my dorm woke up at a more godly hour, so I was the only one prowling the hallways. My room was clear down the far end of the dorm and also the closest to the stairwell leading out to the parking lot. I was walking from the bathroom to my room when I had a creepy chill crawl down my back. I felt like someone was watching me. I tried to shake it off as me just being paranoid and silly, but I couldn't shake it. I didn't dare turn around until I finally reached my door, and that's where I saw it. There was a little man crouched at the other end of the hallway, dressed in all black from head to toe. I couldn't even see his eyes. He just crouched there watching me. I didn't stick around to see what would happen and unlocked my bedroom door and locked it after myself. I never saw it again. The strange bathroom hydro effects continued, and things often came up missing in my room to later be found somewhere other than where I'd left it, but I never mentioned the little ninja spirit in the hallway to anyone until 3 months later when I was sitting down in the living room with a friend late one night. We were comparing ghost stories, trying to spook each other, when his face turned serious and he asked me if I'd seen our ghost yet. I asked him what it had looked like, and he described almost the exact image I had seen. Later, I found out that many people had seen it, although most people just pass it off as being overly tired or that it really hadn't happened. 2 months later, I moved to a less haunted dorm, and I sleep much better. Number 4, The Shadow in the Hall by Chris 0001. Well, I was about 13 when we moved into the new apartment. We had been there a week when I thought I would explore the whole place. Well, I had gone over the whole thing when I noticed a door in the dining room closet ceiling, just big enough for a person to climb through. I'm gonna take a look, I thought to myself. So I took a flashlight and went up to look. Well, I got my head in and the flashlight was on and was just starting to look around when I felt this cold breeze on the back of my head. I felt like someone was breathing on my neck. This was the middle of summer. An attic crawl space should be hot. Well, I felt a feeling of extreme terror and practically fell out of the opening, dropping my flashlight as I came down. It took me almost an hour to get enough courage to close the opening back up. Well, a week passed and I started seeing things out of the corner of my eyes. First, it was just sudden glimpses, but then it happened more often. I finally realized that I would only see strange things when the door to the opening was open. I told my mom to please keep it closed. She never asked me why, she just said she would. It never failed. I could always tell when the door was open. One night, I was sitting in the living room, in the dark, talking to one of my friends on the phone when I saw something peek out of my bedroom right in the direction of the chair I was sitting in. Right away, I dropped the phone and ran into the dining room where my mom and her boyfriend were sitting and slammed the door to the attic closed. I even yelled at her, "Keep the damn door closed, please!" And when I went back, it was gone. As long as the door was closed, I never saw it again. We had moved now, and I don't see things out of the corner of my eye anymore, but thinking of that place still gives me the creeps. Number 5. Alma, Colorado by CelticD. I have always been very careful about telling people this story, but this seemed like a good forum for the telling. It happened about 20 years ago in a town known as Alma, Colorado. At the time, hardly anyone lived in the area. It had been a boom town during the gold rush, but a diphtheria plague almost killed everyone. A saloon girl known as Silver Heels stayed and took care of the dying until finally she died too. The surviving people were so grateful they named the mountain after her. Many people were buried with only a stone to mark the grave. When people such as me went back into the area to homestead, a lot of strange things began happening. Most of us had a lot of sleepless nights and couldn't explain the sounds that were making our animals crazy. Finally, my friends and I decided we would camp in an old abandoned bordello known as the Schwartz House in the heart of Alma. There was a pot-bellied stove in the parlor area and a wood cook stove in the kitchen. The house was very large and had 7 rooms upstairs. There still remained a portrait of Mrs. Schwartz on the parlor wall near the entrance of the house. One of the old-timers there had said that the old woman would never allow women in the house unless they worked for her. We laughed about it and all of us went to our respective rooms. My buddy Kenny and I were staying in one room, sleeping in our sleeping bags across the room from one another. Suddenly, Kenny started yelling, "What the hell are you doing? Get away from me! Stop that!" I woke up and saw him struggling in his sleeping bag. I thought some animal had gotten in the bag with him. I turned on my flashlight and it startled him. He said, "How the hell did you get over there?" We both looked at the sleeping bag and there was something moving in it, and then it stopped. He said, "There was a woman in this bag with me, I swear." I didn't know what to say. Kenny was scared out of his mind. It was almost dawn, so I went downstairs to heat some water for coffee. I had a small machete for cutting some kindling wood. I cut some for the small stove and some for the cook stove. As I loaded up the cook stove and started the fire, I heard what sounded like an argument between 2 women. I actually heard what sounded like scuffling, and as I turned the corner to see what was going on, the machete flew into the wall near my head. I stood there motionless, realizing that there was no one out there but me. At least no one that I could see. The machete was in the wall, still moving back and forth from the force of the impact. I packed my gear and left the house and never returned. So did my friends. The house is still standing and still abandoned to this day. Number 6. The Burns Ranch by troyarn. I spent the first 18 years of my life living in a small Kansas town. Although there was little reason to stay, it was a great place to grow up, and I have many fond memories of exploring the nearby woods and rivers. A lot of strange things happened in and around that town, but I will only tell of one for now. This short story is about the Burns Ranch. The Burns Ranch was located about 5 miles west of town. Situated at the base of a gently sloping hill, literally out of the middle of nowhere. A curving gravel road was the only way to get there and beyond the house. This same road soon petered out into dirty ruts that faded into miles and miles of unused pasture land. The house itself was a 2-story Victorian that had to have been built in the early 1900s. It was old, but wonderfully remodeled and a beauty to behold. A smaller, more modern guest house stood behind it, and an ancient barn nearby completed things. All of this had been done in the Burns family for generations, handed down from one son to the other, till finally Richard Burns inherited it. At the time of this story, Mr. and Mrs. Burns had a newborn baby girl and a son who was about 4 years younger than me. I was a family friend, and while in my high school years would house sit while they were away on business trips or vacation. This was a great gig for any teenager, and I always jumped at the chance to get away from it all and spend some time alone out there. One summer, they asked me to stay at their place for a few weeks. The first week I was to be alone as usual, but the second week their son Robert was going to be there. Although not much younger than me, they for some reason wanted me to keep an eye on him. We get along well enough, so this was all fine with me. I left for the ranch one late afternoon just as the shadows of the day were starting to bend longer towards the east. Weaving through the curves of the road and over the old low water bridges, I finally crested a hill, made my way down to the last of the bridges, passed through a small forest, and then came out into the wide open spaces of prairie land. About 100 yards further down the road was the house. No matter how many times I went out to the ranch, I could never fully get over the creepy feeling that would wash over me the minute the house came into view. It always seemed foreboding and spooky. The place looked, frankly, haunted. One corner of the house formed a rotunda in which Robert's room was located on the second floor. As I neared the house, I could see someone standing in the shadows of his room, holding the curtain back and watching me arrive. Pulling into the driveway, I saw the curtain fall back into place, swinging slightly. It seemed that someone else was home and I wouldn't be alone for that first week after all. The driveway led around the house to the back door, which everyone used when entering or exiting the house. The only time I ever saw the front door used was after dinners when we would go out and sit on the porch to watch the sunset. I locked up the car, went through the gate of the fenced-in yard and knocked on the door, waiting for whoever was inside to answer. When no one did, I went across the yard past a 3-foot statue of the Virgin Mary and toward what amounted to a cement room that had been built into the side of the hill. It was some sort of storm shelter, and near the door I found the keys to the house, which are always hidden there behind an old painting. As I let myself into the foyer, I sat my bags on a bench. I kept calling out to let my presence be known. Dead silence was my only welcome. On the right side of the entranceway were the stairs that led up to the bedrooms. Under the stairs and next to the bench upon which my bag sat was the door that led to the basement. Beyond that door and in front of me was the dining room and the kitchen being to its left. To the right of the dining room were the rest of the downstairs, a few sitting rooms, the library, and an entertainment room. Sure that I saw someone at the window, I began a search of the house, starting with the first floor before working my way upstairs. The stairs ascended to an L-shaped hall. Just to the left were the master bedroom and bath. To the right and down the hall past another bathroom were the baby's room and a spiral staircase that led to one of the sitting rooms below. The guest room I used, as well as Robert's bedroom, was around the corner at the end of the L. I searched these rooms, then went down to the basement, which had been renovated into a modern living room complete with a bar. I found nothing. Perplexed but kind of used to how weird the house could be, I went back upstairs to unpack and start to enjoy my stay. I set up my guitar and amp in the entertainment room where I planned on creating rock songs I was sure millions would jam to in the years to come. The fridge was stocked, so that was no problem, and I had brought along tons of movies to watch on the VCR in the basement. It seemed the only thing I had to worry about was the occasional phone call and feeding the dog, which was in a pen out near the old cement shelter. No problems as far as I was concerned. I had been house-sitting here many times before, and knew how eerie things would feel when the evening came. Like I said, it just had that look of a haunted house. Not much happened that first night, and the next day I got up, fed and watered the dog, then watched a few movies before taking a short walk around the property. That evening the phone rang and it was Mr. Burns. He wanted to know how much it had rained the night before. I knew he was out of state, so told him it didn't rain at all, but he insisted I check his rain counter, a measuring device that he had attached to a post near his mailbox. I went out, and sure enough, although it had been completely dry the last few days, there was about a quarter inch of water at the bottom of the thing. I went back to the phone where he was waiting on the other line and told him. He didn't seem surprised and said it would probably rain that night. He told me to take care and make sure to keep the doors locked and not to let anyone in when evening came. I liked Mr. Burns, and he was a decent guy, but sometimes he talked like that, making little sense at all. So I agreed to do as he said and hung up the phone. About 3 hours later, evening crept up on the ranch, and with it came the first storm of summer. And this wasn't just a small shower, this was a torrent. It came down heavy for about 30 minutes, then calmed down to a steady downpour. Suddenly the phone started ringing. I would answer, but no one would be on the other line. It rang like that all night, about 3 times an hour, and each time I picked up the receiver, I would be greeted with silence. No voice, no signal, nothing, just silence. As the rain came down, I looked out the window down towards the road that led back to town. I saw a flicker of light through the nearby forest and went to stand on the front porch to get a better look. Sure enough, there was someone down there. It seemed a vehicle had stopped just inside the forest at the low water bridge. Whoever it was most likely coming out to the ranch to make sure there was no trouble. I reluctantly slid on my bad weather clothes and went out to the shelter where I hung the key. Then made my way through the rain and the mud down the road towards the light. The wind was howling and the rain pouring down in sheets, but I could still see the light shining whenever I raised my head to see where I was going. I finally got to the curb that led down into the woods and towards the low water bridge, but when I made the turn, there was nothing there. By now, I was really freaked out. The bridge was flooded over and there were no tire marks on either side of it. I could clearly see the other side of the bridge and no one had been down it since well before the rain started. Probably not since I came down the day before. I checked around a few more minutes just to make sure no one happened to be there needing help, and then made my way back to the ranch. The phone was ringing again as I entered, but I didn't bother to pick it up this time. Let it ring. I had wet clothes to get out of and weird lights to think about. I was warming up in the kitchen a few hours later when I heard a car horn go off. A steady drizzle was coming down now, and looking out of the window again, I noticed the lights near the bridge were back. This time dancing around through the trees before turning up the road and coming towards the house. It was a car, and every few seconds the driver would toot the horn a few times. I got on my clothes, wrapped the still damp coat around me, and went out the back door, this time armed with a rifle. I could see nothing past the light of the porch, so went out into the storm carrying the rifle and a small flashlight. I went towards the barn and down the soggy driveway. The horn was still honking, but I could no longer see the road due to the tall brush in the fields, so the car was invisible to me, but getting louder and louder by the moment. Everything suddenly seemed to build up. The car horn got louder. I could now see the glare of the lights growing through the brush. I found myself getting tense, pointing the now cocked rifle in the general direction of whoever was coming down the road. The horn rang out one more time and the light shined just a little brighter. I finally got to the end of the drive and went out onto the road. There was nothing there to greet me, just a dark, wet, stormy night and a muddy road that led to a very flooded bridge. Even the rain seemed to have eased up a bit. After a few minutes of trying to figure all this out, I gave up, covered the rifle so as to keep the water off of it, and trudged back towards the house for the last time that night, deciding it was safer inside than out here in the open. Nothing much happened for the rest of the evening until about 4 a.m. when I was awakened by someone pounding on the front door. This was odd. Everyone always used the back door. Nonetheless, I got out of bed, put my clothes back on, and went downstairs to find out what was going on. My body ached from being out in the storm the night before. I tried to hurry down the stairs and through the house as fast as possible, listening as the banging became more and more persistent. I had an idea that no one was going to be waiting for me on the porch when I opened the door. And I was right. Unable to sleep, I looked around a bit, then brewed a large, strong pot of coffee and sat reading till the sun poked up over the horizon. The day was bright, hot, and humid, and after a short nap, I decided to take a walk around the property. I hung the keys back inside the shelter so as not to lose them, and as I did, I got this strong urge to go into the little room and explore a bit. I have no idea why I would suddenly want to do this since there was really nothing in there, and to be honest, it was not a place I wished to be in. Still, it took a little effort to walk away from the shelter. Something told me not to enter all the way, so I just stuck my hand in and quickly placed the keys behind the painting, and then I shut the heavy door. I took a long walk before going back to the low water bridge. I shut the barn door, which had come open during the previous evening's storm, then made my way to the top of the hill behind the house. From here, I got a great view of everything for miles and miles. I sat up there for some time, then went to the river. The bridge was still flooded out, but not as bad as before. There were no tire marks and no evidence whatsoever of anyone being there before, except for what tracks I had made. I still had no idea as to what happened the night before. I would have thought that it was all a prank, but the storm was a bad one, and besides, the bridge had been out. I went back to the ranch, and the first thing I noticed was the barn door was open again. Already on edge, I peered inside, then closed the door, placing a large rock in front of it. Later that afternoon, while working out a few songs on my guitar, I kept getting a very strong feeling that someone was standing right behind me. No matter where I would sit, the feeling was always there. Growing tired of it, I stopped what I was doing and said aloud, "Will you stop it? I'm trying to do something here." No sooner had I said this than the feeling stopped. It came back whenever I would start to practice my music, but went away when I told it to. The next day, I was upstairs going through some things when I heard very loudly someone downstairs yell out, "Hey!" It startled me at first, but then I thought it might have been the family coming home early, so I put up what I was doing and went down to find an empty house. The rest of my time there alone was uneventful with the exception of a lot of weird feelings. The library for some reason spooked me, as did the shelter, and I refused to use the spiral staircase located next to the baby's room. I was somewhat nervous the whole time and took many long walks. Once while sitting atop of the hill, I saw a car coming towards the ranch. It passed through the forest and made it over the bridge. I was actually a little relieved. Robert had finally showed up. Robert's grandmother had brought him back from a summer camp he had attended, and after we finally said our goodbyes, I sat on the porch with him listening to the various stories he had to tell and looking through the photos he'd brought back. I was reluctant to mention my own tales, but it didn't matter. Robert had grown up in that house. He knew something weird had happened to me while alone there. We spent the next few days enjoying the good weather. We hiked, explored the valleys and forests along the road, and went on drives that took us to places we'd never been to before. One night, just as the sun was setting, Robert finally asked me how my stay had been. I didn't hesitate in telling him some of the odd things that had happened, and he reaffirmed some of them with his own stories. It seemed he too was drawn towards the cement shelter where the keys were hidden. The only difference was that he had gone inside, the heavy door slamming shut and locking him in. It was some time before he was able to push the thing open and get out. He said that the Virgin Mary statue had been moved so it was facing the doorway, as if watching him struggle. He was as confused as I concerning the lights at the bridge and the mystery car, but he did mention seeing a lady come down the spiral staircase I was so afraid of. She came down, glared at him for a moment, and then walked back up. Robert never found out who she was, but felt that she was not nice. He also told me of dreams he had about the library. They were vivid and scary, involving the closet. He had just recently discovered that a relative had been born in that room years ago and had died there as well. Above each bedroom door was a small window, and Robert said one early morning he woke up seeing the shadow of someone come down the hall and stand in front of his slightly open door. The person stood there for some time before Robert called out, thinking it was his father. When he got no reply, Robert screamed for his parents, and as they turned the corner in the hall, the shadow disappeared. That explained why I always felt watched whenever I tried to sleep in the guest room across the hall. As far as Robert's room, I only went in there to get a CD now and then. I never felt comfortable in there ever since I saw someone looking out the window at me as I came up to the house that first day. Towards the end of my stay, Robert and I settled down one evening in the basement. We had movies to watch and were set for the night. There was a small bathroom between the foyer and the kitchen, and in it was an old-fashioned toilet that had a string you pulled when you wanted to flush it. The thing was loud, and as we sat downstairs watching our second movie, we could hear it flushing. We inspected it before finally turning off the water and returning to our movies. Around 1 or 2 o'clock in the morning, we were in that zombie state just before sleep actually comes. Suddenly, we heard the back door slam shut. Wide awake now, we grabbed a few rifles that we had brought down to the basement with us and listened. From right above us, we heard the unmistakable sound of boots shuffling across the foyer floor. They slowly came towards the basement door and stopped. Then we heard the door creak open. I admit I finally came to understand the term shaking like a leaf, but Robert wasn't much braver. We were too scared to even try to pretend to be cool. For a moment, there was nothing, and then whoever was above us came walking down the stairs. We could hear someone brush up against the coats that hung on pegs along the wall. We could hear the firm, deliberate sound of boots making contact with the warped boards that were the steps. The stairway going down into the basement was hidden behind a wall so that anyone who came down could not be seen until they reached the bottom. The third stair from the bottom always made a horrible squeaking noise, and when we heard that, we raised our rifles and waited. And waited. Finally, when no one came into view, I told whoever was there that we were armed and to leave. There was no sound at all. Eventually, we gained a little courage and slowly peeked around the wall and up the stairway. No one was there. The door was shut. I was beyond scared at this point, and after going throughout the house and checking the doors and windows, we spent the rest of the night in the dining room talking about what had happened. To this day, I'm unsure what to think. We heard without a doubt the back door open up and slam shut, but when we checked it, the key was still in the lock and the door was still bolted from the inside. Robert left the next day to go spend a few days at a friend's home. He wasn't surprised when I told him I was asking another friend of mine to come out and stay with me until my final night there. That night was quiet except for the usual strange feelings. Even my friend mentioned it and left early the next morning. Rather than spend another day there alone waiting for Mr. and Mrs. Burns to return, I wrote a note telling them I had to leave early to run a few errands, placing it on the kitchen table. I packed up all my things, made sure the house was cleaned up, and then locked the door. A sudden sense of urgency overcame me as I walked to the shelter to put up the extra key. I came close to just tossing it into the room in my struggle to hurry, but managed somehow to put it back in its proper place on the hook. As I walked to the car, I noticed the barn door was open again, and although I tried to ignore it, I ended up going over and shutting it. The big rock I had put in front of it earlier was gone. No one ever said anything to me about leaving early or asked how my stay was. Mrs. Burns would often laugh at the idea that her house could ever be haunted, but sometimes I think the laughter was a little forced. As for Mr. Burns, when I asked him how he knew it would rain that evening when I checked the level of water in his gauge, he looked at me puzzled and swore he never even called me during that trip. I still don't know what to make of that place. Like I said, lots of strange things happen in and around the small town I grew up in, and that was just one of them. Alright, and that wraps it up. Thank you so much, I hope you enjoyed it, and if you want to keep watching, here's my video on 5 more urban legends from around the United States. Thanks so much. Good night.